per year. It's a networking theory thing. Eventually, there's more than a 50-50 chance that we will either contact someone or be contacted by someone. Hugh says less than a decade. Bridget shook her head.
Okay, fine. I'm not thrilled with the alternative timeline anyway.
And hey, if anyone wants a break, I'm available, Will said, grinning. That downstream thing looked like just too much fun. I stood, signaling the end of the meeting. We have 6 hours until we're scheduled to wake our mannies. Take care of whatever you need to. 18. Not part of the plan. Will, June 2334, Quinn. I pulled myself off the rack, staggering slightly. The proportions of the Quinlan Manny would take some getting used to. I was examining the not insubstantial claws on my hand when the other Manny opened its eyes. Hey, Howard. I held up a hand. Dig these crazy nails. He gave me a frown. You gone hippie on me, Riker? I grinned at him and he smiled back. Thanks for inviting me, Will. I admit I'm curious about Bridget's project, and her description of the swimming was more enthusiastic than she generally gets about things. I signaled the drone to open the cargo door. No prob, I'm curious too, although I also have a responsibility to practice in case I'm called up. That's my story anyway. I gestured to the door and we walked out together. I'd parked the drone in a different city, somewhat larger than the one Bob and Bridget had visited, and a good deal more messed up. We'd have to avoid areas with too much radiation. Even the Mannies weren't immune to the damaging effects, but just about anything else could be ignored. I wanted to get a cross-section of the types of warfare that the Quinlans had waged on each other. This city had been pounded by explosives. Maybe missiles, maybe dropped bombs. Not kinetics, though. Those wouldn't have left much to examine. The city had likely been a capital, or at least a major hub of some kind. It had that all roads lead to Rome feel about it, at least from the air. The Quinlans had used rail for overland transport, and there were a lot of rail lines leading here. The city also had larger blocks with more widely spaced waterways. I wondered if that was an efficiency thing or if they just needed the bigger blocks for some other reason. According to Bob and Bill, the Quinlan psychology seemed to be very human-like, but I was reluctant to over-extrapolate. We walked up to the nearest canal and inspected the contents. It didn't seem too bad. Certainly not as oily and turgid as Bob had described on their excursion. If anything, the canal seemed to have a surprisingly robust current. Looks nice, Howard said. Real estate is less damaged than what you'd expect, I replied. Bridget took a tissue sample and had it scanned. Huge viral load, and the Skippy's modeling indicates it was likely an engineered virus. So biological warfare on top of everything else? Mm-hmm. It looks like the entire population had a tantrum and started throwing everything they had at everyone they could. I'm surprised they managed to get to this stage technologically. Maybe it's a population density thing? I grunted and changed the subject. I searched for a good, undamaged canal. With the pounding this city received, some have been filled with debris or even had their water flow blocked entirely. I figure we shouldn't get too adventurous. Sounds good. Shall we? Without waiting for an answer, Howard dove in. I followed immediately and spotted him, already disappearing into the distance. I pursued, tail and arm flaps working in concert. Howard glanced back without turning his head. This is definitely worth doing. I could sell this. See the ruined world of the Quinlans quake at the sight of blasted cities, gaze in awe at the... I dare you to try and get that past Bridget. Howard laughed. You got me there. She'd flay me alive. Okay, so maybe not tours of the Quinn ruins, but even if we just copied the Mannies and put them on Vulcan... maybe not. What? I could hear the smile in Howard's voice. Vulcan has that dinosaur theme, and it carries into the marine life. Lots of big, hungry native critters. In the rivers, maybe? Maybe. Have to look into it. We swam in a companionable silence for a few more minutes, stopping to examine a couple of submerged wrecks. I imagined the experience would be a lot like scuba diving, except every video I'd ever seen of humans underwater showed them as slow and ungainly, struggling to push themselves through the water at a snail's pace. The Quinlan forms moved more like otters, or maybe penguins, since the Quinlans didn't quite have the sinuous flexibility of otters. Curious, the current is surprisingly strong here, Howard said. The city didn't seem to have that much of a grade. I'm not an expert, but that seems like more of a concern than a curiosity. I sounded like a wet blanket, even to my own ears, but I developed an attitude from terraforming Valhalla that unusual equaled bad. Exceptions had been rare. Sure, okay. It's stronger over here. I'll just have a yipe! And this would not be one of those exceptions. Howard, what happened? I'm being sucked down. Ow! A tunnel of some kind. Wait, there's light up. Oh, shit! I sent a quick order to the cargo drone to lift off, center itself on our location, and do a Sudar sweep. Meanwhile, I put some distance between myself and Howard's last known position. I'm going to need a ride, Howard said into the silence. What happened? I just got spit out of a tunnel into mid-air and did a bit of flying, but not the good kind. I think I broke the Manny. I've got my beacon on. Drone has located you. One moment. I piggybacked the drone's video window as it lowered itself into a mostly dry canal. Spread eagle on a bed of rocks and branches was a Quinlan form. Some of the limb positions were definitely not natural. How did this happen? I was sucked into a tunnel and got spit out here. I think I flew about 50 yards before landing. It looks like the city builders put in tunnels between canals to equalize water levels, but this canal is mostly dry. I bet it's blocked upstream. In the video, roamers were collecting Howard and bundling him into the drone. Have you checked your diagnostics? Yeah. This baby is going to need some work. I'm surprised I'm still connected, honestly. The comms subsystem is tough. There was a pause. Don't tell Bridget. She'll kill me. I smiled, although Howard couldn't see it. I understand you've got a new red ale in the works. Riker's Red, I think it's called. No, it's... Another pause. You're a bastard. Yes, but now I'm a bastard with a red ale named after me. 19. You did what? Bob, June 2334, Garrick's spine. I activated my Manny and sat up, rubbing my eyes. I wasn't sure if it was something Quinlan's did, but it felt right. I peered out the small single window, still dark. We'd gone to bed yesterday while it was still light out, so we had missed the Heavens River sunset. I wanted to see the sunrise. Mostly, I wanted to see for myself how Heavens River handled emulation of night and day. I'd woken a few minutes early to be certain I was up before the dawn, but I'd left a message with the others. Quietly, not for my crew's sake, but for the other occupants of the motel, I snuck out of our room and down the stairs to the front door. The air felt crisp and cool and wouldn't be out of place in early fall on Earth. Item. The artificial sun supplied heat as well as light to the habitat. That implied a heat sink of some kind at ground level, since this was otherwise a closed system. My bet was that the water was kept below ambient, probably cooled by the river bottom impeller filters. Maybe the central cylinder absorbed infrared as well when the sun was off. No one else was about. We knew that Quinlans were primarily diurnals, so no big surprise. There might be a night guard wandering around and maybe a paper boy or something, but otherwise I pretty much had the street to myself. Or so I thought, until a voice beside me said, "Morning." "Morning, Bill." Had the same idea? Mm-hmm. Lots of data from the drones, but nothing beats eyewitness. We stood quietly, watching, as a light gradually grew at one end of the gigantic cylinder that was Heavens River. By convention, we translated that direction as east, with the other compass points falling naturally into place. North was anti-spinward and south was spinward, but from inside, you wouldn't be able to tell without doing some very sensitive experiments. Under this coordinate system, this branch of the river flowed generally west. "It's quite directional," Bill said into the silence. "What?" "The light from the central structure. In theory, we should be able to see it from hundreds of miles away, but it doesn't become apparent until it's relatively close. I think it's masked in some way to only shine over a limited range." It makes sense. That would also mimic the early morning and late afternoon dimming of a natural sun due to atmospheric effects. Finally, the sky had turned a discernible blue, and the pseudo-sun was clearly visible at an angle of perhaps 10 degrees above the horizontal. It wasn't a perfect illusion. For one thing, every point on the surface of the habitat would see the sun pass directly overhead, as if everyone was at the equator. For another, the swing across the sky wouldn't be evenly paced because the pseudo-sun moved at a constant pace along the central cylinder. It would appear to accelerate as it approached local zenith, then slow down afterward. Noon would be very brief. But the sky is blue. Have we figured that out yet? Bill turned to me. "Some of it could be just light scattering, but yeah, you'd think we'd be able to see more of the interior. Maybe not all the way around, but more than we do." "It's a hologram." I jerked as Will's comment came out of the blue through my comms. "What?" "It's a hologram. Very weak one, non-directional, and no detail. All it does is mask the central cylinder and reinforce the blue scattering slightly, just enough to give the effect that it does of fading out the interior in the distance." "That's interesting," Bill said. "How did you get this information?" "Inspecting the segment scans. We found some hologram projectors on the central cylinder. Big suckers." "Makes sense, I guess." "What makes sense?" Bill and I both turned as we heard Bridget's voice. She and Garfield had just exited the motel, presumably looking for us. "Will's comment, run through the playback. You'll understand." Bridget closed her eyes and turned her face up to the sun. "Feels good. The builders put a lot of effort into making this as homey as possible." Yeah. Which argues against the forced colonization scenario, which brings us back to the question.
"Well, you all seem to be up very early. Got somewhere special to be?"
We all turned again at this latest unexpected voice. It was the cop. The same cop that we'd run into yesterday. I wondered for a moment if maybe he was a manny and didn't need sleep. But in a small town, there were probably only a few members of law enforcement, so maybe back-to-backs weren't that unusual. "Just discussing breakfast, sir," I said, trying to project hungry.
"There are lots of eateries along here, gents and lady, but most won't be open yet. Best find a place to plant your behinds that doesn't leave you in the middle of the street blocking traffic while you wait."
He glared at us significantly. "What traffic?" The street was virtually deserted except for our group. Wow, this guy was a bit of a dick. "Yes, sir, we need to get our morning routine going anyway." I turned to head back to the motel, but the cop stopped me with a truncheon pressed against my chest. Yes, a billy club. One of those things cops always carry in cartoons.
"Best you be behaving yourselves here on in. I don't want to have to notice you again. You understand?"
I remembered Fred from my time with the Deltons, and fantasized for a moment about grabbing this doofus by the throat and hoisting him in the air. But the feeling passed in a mill or two, and my Manny showed no outward sign of the internal struggle. "Yes, sir, not a problem." The cop examined us for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. Garfield rolled his eyes and grinned.
"We's juvenile delinquents, we is, cool."
Bridget glared at him.
"That was the worst attempt at a Cockney accent I've ever heard. Unless you were going for Irish, in which case it was even worse. Don't do that again."
I chuckled. "How often does Howard do that?"
"Daily, and he says it never gets old."
We returned to our closet room and sat. "Suggestions?" I asked. Why don't we just split up for the moment? Bill replied. This isn't Thunderdome. It's a small, peaceful village. Just wander around and eavesdrop. Maybe one of us will pick up a lead or at least some useful information. Reasonable, Garfield replied. I vote for that. No one seemed inclined to argue. Okay, let's give it an hour to keep Officer Friendly off our backs, then we'll head out. An hour was plenty of time to get things done in the bobbiverse. We set our mannies on standby and went home. An hour later, I had successfully hunted down breakfast of sorts at a nearby pub/eatery. Quinlan's didn't really differentiate. I looked down at the plate of fish parts and tried to control my face. The barkeep wasn't pranking me. Other Quinlans had similar fare in front of them.
Something wrong?
He said, eyeing me. No, I just realized how often I've had squiz lately. I'll be fine. He snorted and turned away. Apparently being a barkeep didn't require empathy or conversational prowess. Really, this wasn't much different from sushi, and I'd loved sushi. I still loved sushi, and had it regularly in Vert. Nope, not helping. It still looked like chopped up raw fish. With a sigh, I directed the embedded AMI to eat the meal while I backed away slightly from foreground processing. I cranked up my audio and tried to pick up something besides the snarfing, snorting sounds of Quinlan diners. They weren't anywhere near as bad as on Pav. I'd seen Pav meals. There were many BobTube videos of Pav families eating, complete with overdubbed sports commentary. It occurred to me to wonder if the Pav had seen some of those vids. It might explain their attitude. Still, Quinlans weren't paragons of refined dining either. Family discussions, gossip, who had or hadn't been arrested for drunken disorderly, occasional business discussions. There was plenty of talk, but it was all routine. Mostly, anyway. I focused in on one discussion in particular between two Quinlans.
Another bunch of blow-ins again this week. Only some of them Sabbatarians. No one seems to know what's going on. I'd be less bothered by it if they spent their coin. But they all tend to be tight-fisted. And surly. Think they're criminals running away from something? Or maybe they've been scattered? That many? What about this bandit militia? Haven't heard of any recent battles. Doesn't make sense.
Well, that was interesting. It could just be some local thing, but it was worth checking out, especially the reference to scattered, which had been spoken with peculiar emphasis. I glanced around, trying not to be obvious about it, until I spotted the speakers. A couple of fat, older Quinlans, probably local merchants. They were wearing decorative baubles and cosmetic fur coloring that would never survive a swim. If I remembered my sociology, that was a wealth or privilege display, showing that they didn't have to go into the water. Maybe someone else could pick something up. Guys, see if you can find out anything about large movements of untalkative strangers, and maybe get a definition for this slang word, scattering. I received acknowledgments from the others and went back to eavesdropping. The conversation moved on to more commercial matters, unfortunately. After several more minutes, I accepted that no new information was forthcoming. My meal being finished, thank the universe, I decided to go for a walk. I stopped, taken aback, as I exited the eatery. Traffic had still been thin when I went in. Apparently, Quinlans all got up at the same time. Or maybe there was a generally agreed-upon workday. For whatever reason, it was now chaos. I couldn't detect anything like a right-side, left-side rule or even sidewalk roadway. Pedestrians dodged in and out of traffic, while animal-drawn carts maneuvered past each other and generally ignored people on foot. I eyed the draft animals, a vaguely ox-like beast that the Quinlans call a hound. They were huge and could probably crush an adult Quinlan without even noticing. Only their slow, steady gait allowed people to dodge them in apparent safety. The carts were interesting. None of the contents were exposed. Some were covered in tarps, some were bundled and strapped down, and some carts were completely enclosed. It seemed like it would be a lot of work as opposed to just piling stuff into the back. I walked up behind a cart and peered in. Definitely well attached, and since it was unlikely the hounds were going to take the carts around corners on 2 wheels, I wondered if grab and run was an issue. I was surprised by a shout.
"Hey, you! Get away from my cart! Police! Thief!"
I looked up and realized the driver had been shouting at me. Geez, hair trigger much? Sir, I wasn't...
Well, look who it is.
That was a familiar voice, and not in a good way. I turned to find Officer Friendly leering at me, slapping his truncheon into his hand, again with the cartoon posture, and I couldn't help a moment of amusement. Listen, I wasn't...
"I think you were, lad, and we'll be talking about it down at the station. About face and march."
He attempted to prod me with his truncheon, and by reflex I swiveled my upper body to the right to let the weapon pass by. A slight nudge with my left arm ensured that the cop's attempted jab would keep going. He scowled and brought the truncheon back in a backhanded swipe to my head. However, since I already had control of the truncheon-carrying limb with my left arm, I simply leaned back and guided it over my head. Hundreds of seconds of virtual kung fu training were coming together, and I wanted to whoop with joy, except, cop. And speaking of, Officer Friendly was now in full umbrage. He began yelling for backup. It took me a second to realize that backup would come, not from the police force, but from passers-by. People turned to the fracas and came at me, hands out to grab. It seemed neighborhood watch was a thing. Guys, I seem to have gotten in trouble with the law. I think we're all going to have to leave town, like, now. Bill replied right away. What in hell did you do? Looked in a wagon. I'm not kidding, that's all I did. Didn't even touch it. These people really have anger management issues. Fine, Bill replied. We'll meet downstream. Don't show off, Bob. Nothing inhuman or un-Quinlan, you know what I mean. I did. My android body was capable of speed and strength that no Quinlan could possibly match. I needed to avoid making them think there was some super Quinlan out there. This exchange had only taken a mill or so, and people were still coming at me. I rolled off the outside of the first person's grab, then took him around and pushed him into the next person. The push-off allowed me to reverse direction, and I found myself face-to-face with another individual. His expression was just starting to register surprise when I pushed him into someone else, resulting in the beginning of a total tangle and allowing me to change direction again. I now had people going in 3 different directions trying to catch me. It took no more than a nudge to an off-balance pursuer, and he was down, taking several others with him. Now I had an open space, and I went for it, trying to keep my speed within Quinlan norms, right into Officer Friendly. To his credit, he was probably used to this kind of chase, or maybe he just guessed right, but there he was, right in the middle of my escape route. He grinned an evil grin as he opened his arms wide to keep me from going around him. Instead, I went straight at him. Before he even had time to register shock, I straight-armed him, ran right up his chest as he went over backward, and launched off his forehead as he hit the ground. That wasn't going to make me any friends, but then I wasn't planning on hanging around. I had a clear shot at the river now. A short gallop to the docks, a quick leap down to the wooden deck, ending with a long dive into the drink. I heard splashes behind me as others gave chase, but I was out of direct sight now, and I could pour on the horses. Flat out, I hit about twice the speed of a biological Quinlan, and I didn't have to come up for air. In seconds, I was far out of their reach. They would hopefully conclude that I'd simply doubled back or otherwise lost them. Clear of the town, waiting downstream, I announced to the team.
Hey, I have a great idea. Let's put Bob in charge.
Bridget glared at me, but I could see her trying not to smile. Yeah, bring it on, I replied. I got you delinquent right here. We all shared a chuckle, and Bill said, So it went from you looking in a wagon all the way to a riot in seconds. I replied. Literally, seconds. I saw the fracas as I headed for the water, Garfield added. There were a couple dozen people involved, all yelling. I think some of them had started to fight each other. We lapsed into silence. We were all floating downstream on the river, linked hands and feet in the usual Quinlan way. The current was slow, no more than a few miles per hour. Walking speed, maybe slightly more. I tilted my head and closed my eyes to absorb a little heat from the sun. It was mid-afternoon now, and we were far enough from Garak to finally be able to relax. In the distance, boats moved up and down river. The Quinlans had sailboats with proper triangular sail designs, which I could see tacking back and forth as they crossed the river northward, or in beam reach as they headed up or down river. I noticed, though, that there was a lot more downriver traffic. I wondered if they tended to go back upriver by circling around on one of the other main rivers. That would certainly be easier, if a little more roundabout. There were also boats that used one or more hounds on a treadmill as a source of motive power. That didn't strike me as terribly efficient. But efficiency was more of an industrial-era concern. Very probably was more than fast enough for a pre-steam society.
You know, Bob, you may have been right, Bridget said, interrupting my reverie.
About?
When you said they have anger management issues. We saw several fights during the brief time we were in town, and no one seemed surprised. Quinlans are just naturally belligerent. More so even than humans.
I don't know about belligerent, Bill replied. They seem, well, polite is too strong a word. Agreeable, maybe?
Okay, how about short-tempered?
Yeah. Hair-trigger tempers sounds about right.
So any luck on finding out anything new?
I asked. I found a bookstore. I was perusing when I suddenly had to leave town. Garfield glared at me. Cool. What kind of titles? Mostly fiction. Some philosophy and soft sciences, how-tos, stuff like that. Garfield shifted his grip from a forepaw to a hind paw and put his hands behind his head. It's a little jarring because this isn't actually an 18th century society. The people, at least some of them, are aware of higher tech. They just don't have access to it, but it's like no one wants to bring it up. Some kind of threat from management? That's all I can think of, but that implies that management is watching. Which brings up the question of how. I took a moment to dunk my head and cool off. The Manny could handle far more temperature variation than an actual Quinlan, but we were wired up to experience reality in as Quinlan-like a manner as possible. The sun felt good, but so did a nice soaking. I wish we had SUDAR scanning capability built into the Mannies. We could just scan everything and look for hidden cameras. Or mobile cameras, Garfield said. Artificial birds and such. That seems like a stretch, Bill said. On the other hand, roamers. Yeah. So we have to avoid looking suspicious while looking suspiciously at everything. I looked around and made a gesture encompassing the group. Also, no more English conversations out loud. Any discussions like we're having right now should be held on intercom.
Starting now,
Bridget added.
I don't think anyone will be suspicious of a group of Quinlans quietly floating downstream.
The water was calm and undisturbed, the pace slow. I had a mental image of Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer floating down the Mississippi. For all the potential issues, life as a Quinlan was probably idyllic. As a natural predator, Quinlans could feed themselves as they traveled. We didn't know how deep the Heavens River ecosystem was compared to the original Quinn biosphere, but it was a safe bet that it was self-sustaining. That meant at least some predator-prey action. And with no social media or devices, there would be no notion of being constantly online. You could literally float down the river every day looking for the next town, or even sleep midstream if you preferred. It was like Eden in many ways, a slower, more relaxed pace. I idly watched the shoreline as we floated. Details changed, but the broad strokes didn't. Occasional farms were visible, but agriculture didn't form anything like as large a part of the Quinlan lifestyle and diet as with humans. I spotted small homesteads, a slight curl of smoke giving them away as often as any visible structures. Use of fire would be an unfortunate side effect of a pre-industrial civilization, but presumably there was some kind of filtering for the air. We'd floated past a couple of splits and merges in the river system, plus the occasional feeder. I couldn't help being impressed. The amount of detail work that had been put into this place was truly amazing. A Quinlan could spend their whole life exploring and still not know every bend and turn. Never mind 1 billion miles worth of different towns and villages on 4 different rivers. As prisons went, if it was indeed a prison, it could be a lot worse. The sun moved in the sky, gaining on us in its own downstream journey. A 21-hour day meant we'd have slightly less time than we would expect to find a place to land and seek lodging. There was no inter-town communication system that we knew of, and anyway, once we left, the Garrick gendarmes probably wouldn't give a hoot. We hadn't come upon another town by nightfall, so we pulled ourselves out of the water and formed a small nest from the local underbrush. According to Bridget, the Heavens River ecology was complete enough to include large herbivores and their predators, which included a couple of animals that might be inclined to see Quinlans as a food group. Our mannies were completely believable, right down to smelling like Quinlans, but that could be turned off. We left the mannies on standby and returned to Vert. "So, kiddies, what have we learned today?" I asked. "Quinlans are short-tempered, and cops even more so," Bill replied. "Useful information, but not particularly getting us closer to finding Bender," Garfield added. "I did a search through the Skippy's online databases for uses of the word scatter and all variations and declensions," Will said. "Filtering out all the mundane usages, we have quite a few references. No good definitions, because everyone seems to know what everyone means when the word is used, but from context, it's not a good thing, and seems to happen to anywhere from one person up to large groups." Interesting. Not sure if it relates to our situation necessarily, but anything might be useful at this point. I looked around at my friends. Intercom the rest of us if you think of something else. Otherwise, see you all in 6 hours. 20. Just in case. Marcus, July 2334, Poseidon. Maleb blew out a loud breath and put the tablet down on his already crowded desk.
Interesting times, but are you sure you aren't being a little bit paranoid?
Maleb was the son of Cal and Gina, 2 of my closest friends from the early days of Poseidon. He took his sheer size from his father and his Polynesian complexion from his mother. I no longer had an urge to tear up when I saw him, but it had been a problem for a while. His parents had long since passed away, and now Maleb was getting on in years, with hair more gray than black. Ephemerals. It was the dirty word of the bobbiverse, but I desperately missed my friends and had made very few new ones since. "Probably," I replied. "All I really have is what Howard told me, and he hadn't been at the moot, so he'd gotten the lowdown from Will. At this remove, I should consider myself lucky I've gotten names right." Maleb chortled and picked up the tablet again.
"So, these Starfleet wannabes might follow through with their threats, and if they do, it might affect us. So what do you want from me?"
"I don't have anything specific, Maleb, but if I were still in charge of equipment, I'd be doing software audits and changing passwords and maybe increasing physical security. Maybe only to the extent of moving things without announcing it. As it is, well," I motioned to him.
"Yeah, that's my job. I get that part. Look, Marcus, I'm not like a feudal lord. I can't just arbitrarily issue orders to change auto factory schedules. These days, they are an integral part of the economy, and heavily regulated.
And I get that, but you do have some flexibility in some areas. I just want to put the bug in your ear. Think about it. And if you can do anything in the normal course of your job that might have a secondary goal useful to us, well, it might turn out to be valuable. Malib turned his head slightly and squinted at me.
You're very carefully not saying something. Is there a potential danger to the citizens of Poseidon?
Not physical danger, I don't think, I said, shaking my head to emphasize the point. Economically? Maybe. Look, there's not much they can do to us in Vert, so if something goes down, it'll be in physical space, which means you'll get at least some fallout. He stared at the ceiling for a few seconds, then began nodding slowly.
I have a little more leeway where actual threats are concerned. I'll still have to tread carefully, but I can at least get a few projects bumped up in priority.
That's all I ask. One down, many to go. I wondered how the other Bobs were doing with their contacts. The common area outside Malib's office door was dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that gave a clear view through New Thark's Fibrex dome. I paused to take in the view, and a few staff members glanced up. It was interesting how society kept evolving. The work-anywhere telecommuting style that had developed in the days after the Mat War had gradually given way to a returning preference for an actual workplace. Seemed people liked being in physical contact with their coworkers and felt alienated when they were constantly on their own. Of course, rush hour was no longer even a concept for most humans, so the economic and social cost of going to work was nearly non-existent. I shook my head to clear the wool gathering and turned my attention back to the view. A mat floated in the calm, impossibly blue ocean at middle distance with a city hovering just to one side. I could have looked up the name but didn't bother. These days, mats were strictly industrial or agricultural locations, usually owned and controlled by specific cities. No one lived on the mats except the occasional self-exiled hermit. The technological defenses kept the ocean predators so completely at bay that a new ecosystem was evolving on the mats based on the lack of predation. Howard's wife Bridget had visited us several times to do studies. I turned and headed for the transit station. Malib's reassurances notwithstanding, the Bobs still had a significant industrial presence in the Poseidon system. We kept it low-key and out of the official economic calculation engines, but it would still need the same review for possible vulnerability. I sent a message to Guppy asking for a summary of the audit so far. I'd have to get personally involved soon, but for now, the sun felt good, and the grassy ring around the edge of New Thark called out for my butt to be planted thereupon. 21. Getting involved. Bob, July 2334, Arcadia River System. I sat up, water running off my fur and puddling around my butt. It was raining. I had a momentary surge of irritation, the kind of thing you get when you've been caught outside without an umbrella. This was followed by irritation that the AMI hadn't alerted me to the issue. It had been raining for some time, judging from the level of wetness of, well, everything. But the irritation was swept away as I remembered my current form. There was no chill, no feeling of shivering dampness. The Quinlan fur with its waterproofing kept me nice and toasty. I gazed up at the sky. The rain clouds resembled rain clouds everywhere, gray, ugly, and wet. The striations might have been a little weird because of the megastructure's rotation, but then again, maybe not. I wasn't a weather expert, and my interest in cloud formations had always been limited to staying out from under the wet ones. I examined the horizon in several directions. I thought it might be lighter to the west, but generally speaking, we were socked in all directions. So, large weather systems? Check. I frowned. I could have done without this particular reproduction of a planetary environment.
"Look at this,"
Bridget said. I turned. I hadn't realized she'd activated yet. She was pointing at some underbrush that had been crushed flat.
"I think we revisited overnight. Something big. Maybe a La Roche."
I searched my memory. La Roche was kind of a big wolf, but with claws like a grizzly bear. It grasped its prey and held it while it tore off chunks. Not a fun date, for sure. Why didn't our AMIs alert us?
"I don't think it displayed any interest, Bob. The track doesn't actually come into our nest. I think lack of odor and body heat threw it off. A night hunter isn't going to be depending on sight, so the fact we only look like a meal probably wasn't enough."
I grimaced, glad that we had Bridget along to pay attention to this kind of thing. On Eden, my introduction to the local ecosystem had been gradual, and mostly from the safety of orbit. Now, I was in the middle of it, and I hadn't yet internalized the studies. Bill and Garfield sat up at that moment. Garfield looked at my face and Bridget's face and said, "What did I miss?" Bridget laughed.
"Let's see about breakfast."
"Fish on the hoof? No thanks," I replied. "I'll eat in town. Maybe a good Denver omelet with some hot sauce."
"Sure, we'll get right on that."
Bridget prairie-dogged and scanned the river.
"Do we want to just float today, or should we put some hustle on?"
"As much as this feels like a vacation," I replied, "it isn't. Let's get ourselves to a town." It took most of the day to find the next town, even with the group actively swimming downstream. With no witnesses to worry about, we were able to pile on the speed and ignore fatigue warnings, and in the water there was no danger of overheating the manis. Bill spotted the town first. "Coming up on the left, guys. Slow to flank speed." Don't get pedantic, Gar. Slow to whatever is normal for a Quinlan, okay? I smiled to myself. Bill and Garfield sniped at each other constantly, but it was never heated. Marvin and I had the same kind of interaction. I realized it had been a long time since I'd visited him. I didn't even know if he was still working his way through all the fictional environments we'd read about. Maybe it was time to get over myself and rejoin bobbiverse society, while there still was one. We swam up to the docks and climbed up the ramp in the acceptable manner, best not attract attention. The plaque at the head of the dock said Galen Town and included some helpful arrows to useful locations. We noted an arrow that said Market and headed in that direction. We still hadn't worked out any kind of concrete plan, since we didn't even have enough information to form one. The skippies were still listening in with the spy drones, but they hadn't come up with anything new. It wasn't surprising when you looked at the big picture. We still hadn't come close to scanning the entire structure in detail. And even with the surprisingly large Quinlan population numbers, they were spread quite thin. Every single town couldn't possibly have a significant presence, and we still needed to figure out what that might be. "Let's try not to screw it up this time," I said. Excuse me?" Bill exclaimed. "Who was it that started a riot last time? Anyone? Picky. Seriously. Maybe we can make some headway today. You guys want to split up?" "I think we have to, Bob. We'll cover more territory." I nodded, gave a small wave, Quinlan style, and headed in a random direction. The point was to eavesdrop on conversations and maybe try to start one and probe subtly for information. I had my concerns about that subtly part. I was far more familiar with the art of war than the art of conversation. But where can you go where everybody knows you're... No, but close. Liquor loosens lips, or muzzles, or beaks, or haora, as the Quinlans called their cake holes. So where would I find a pub and or boozery? I went up to the first person who was holding still. "Excuse me, is there a tavern nearby?"
"Yes. My brother-in-law owns the Growling Guppy. Down that lane, turn right at the house with the red door. You'll see it. Tell them Gren sent you."
I nodded my thanks and set off in the indicated direction. I was pretty sure Gren got a kickback of some kind, and I didn't begrudge him. I might even get a break on the first beer. Brother-in-law wasn't quite the right translation for the relationship, I knew. The Quinlans had a complicated family system, but I got the impression that Gren and his pub-owning mate were on pretty close terms. I arrived at the establishment in short order. It was, as advertised, easy to pick out. An outside patio with long benches and tables featured a lot of Quinlans holding beer steins. It seemed every hour was happy hour for Quinlans. Was swimming while under the influence a felony? I sidled up to the bar and signaled for attention. To the barkeep I said, "Gren tells me I can get a beer here?" The barkeep eyed me closely, probably checking his memory. Then he grabbed a stein, filled it, and set it down.
"First one's 1 copper. After that, 2 coppers.
I pulled out the appropriate coin, set it on the bar, and grabbed my beer. I had a bad feeling this was not going to compare favorably with Howard's red ales. Well, I could always turn off my taste buds. I scanned the tables. I was looking for a spot where I was potentially within earshot of several conversations. I needed to have a much better picture of this society before I'd be ready to dive in and strike up a conversation, especially after last time. I plunked my butt down on a bench and hunched over my stein, trying to look like it was the center of my universe. Then I turned up my audio gain and relaxed into creepy eavesdropper mode.
Can't believe that Ginny wants to bring that fish entrail-brained loser into the family.
So he says to me, Berro, he says, I got a right mind to... That's just too funny. The guy really thought...
Claims to have been scattered twice. I mean, what are the chances?
Wait, scattered? There was that word. The Skippies hadn't been able to nail it down beyond that it was something bad. This could be important. I filtered out the other conversations. First voice.
Probably a troublemaker. You can get caught up in a scattering once by chance, but twice? No. Skeeve had to be involved in whatever was going on.
Second voice.
So if he starts up the same shenanigans here, our whole town could end up scattered.
Third voice.
But that's not fair. Why would we all suffer?
First voice.
Fair isn't part of the administrator's vocabulary, youngling. If they decide we've contravened the limits, they will act.
Third voice.
How do we stop that from happening?
First voice.
We can't stop the administrator, but we can prevent Skeeve from brewing more trouble and causing a scattering in our home.
Second voice.
What do you have in mind, Errol? Talk to him? Make him listen to reason?
A laugh from first voice.
Sure, that'll work. Or maybe he just ends up as fish food.
Second voice.
I'm in.
Third voice.
I've never killed anyone, but I can't lose my family. I'm in.
First voice.
Good people. So, I invite him here for a beer or dinner to discuss things. Get him a little tipsy, make him think we're on his side, then invite him to my place and take care of business.
A pause.
You guys have to be convincing, though. He has to believe we're ready to buy into his crazy ideas.
I turned a casual eye in the direction of the voices. 2 Quinlans were nodding as a third Quinlan glared at both of them in turn. Those were my marks. Their conversation drifted off into more mundane subjects without shedding any more light on Skeeve's sins or the nature of the administrator. I could hear the capital letter when they said it. Literally, the Quinlan language included an inflection to indicate proper names. I listened for a while longer until I'd finished my, beverage. It was every bit as bad as I'd expected, but no other interesting conversations offered themselves. You guys discover anything? I said over the intercom. I hoped I had kept the triumph out of my voice.
No, but it sounds like you have,
Bridget replied, dashing my hopes.
But at least I found a good hotel. Meet at the dock?
Everyone signaled their agreement, and I set off for the rendezvous. Okay, Bob. Spill. What did you get? Garfield asked. Let's get a room and shut down, I replied. I'll go over it back in Vert. We made our way to the hotel that Bridget had found, negotiated with the proprietor, and in short order found ourselves in another small bunk room. Someday we should try moving up the social ladder. I'd like to actually have room to turn around without elbowing someone, Bill said. Why? Garfield replied. We're just racking the Mannies here. What are you planning on doing? Bill glared at him but didn't reply. We picked bunks and lay down, then deactivated. I popped into my library and was just settling myself into my lazy boy when the others arrived. Their favorite furniture was ready for them, since this was a long-term project and they'd be here a lot. Jeeves brought beverages, Spike picked a random lap to colonize, and we settled in. All right, here's what I overheard. I queued up the conversation from the tavern and played it back. When it was done, there were several milliseconds of silence. Garfield was the first to speak. So, scattering. Does it chase off the miscreants? It's a little more than that, I think, Bill said. There was talk of collateral damage. Our whole town could end up scattered, he said. So, the administrator, whoever he is... It, Bill said, interrupting Garfield. The speaker definitely used a third-person indeterminate, or maybe they. The Quinlan language doesn't differentiate between singular and plural for this declension. Okay, whoever they are. They scatter a town if people get uppity. How, I wonder? And what defines uppity? We have to get to Skeeve before the hit squad does their dirty work, I said, interrupting Bill and Garfield's discussion. Ideas? Let's just be waiting at the tavern, Bill said. Yum, I replied. More swill. I played with my fish soup, trying to pretend I was eating. Bill and Garfield were doing slightly better, and Bridget had tucked into it like a native. Biologists. Jeez. We were beginning to get worried after several hours of waiting. The barkeep was eyeing us since we weren't drinking enough to pay for the seats. Garfield had finally had enough. We need to consider the possibility that they changed their plans. Do we know what other taverns are around this area? Bridget leaned over and poked a neighbor with a finger. Hey, friend, how many other taverns within walking distance? He turned with a frown, but his expression changed when he took in her three friends. Apparently deciding on courtesy as a tactic, he mentioned 2 other locations and gave us general directions. I'd given the others a video image of our targets, so Bill and Garfield hurried off to check the other bars. Meanwhile, I bought our neighbor a beer for his trouble, and he became considerably friendlier, if a little perplexed. I've got them, Garfield said. They're just leaving the prancing Praelia. I guess they must have changed plans. We're lucky we didn't wait any longer. Stay with them, Gar, I replied. We've got you on pings. We'll get there as soon as we can. Bridget and I leaped up and sprinted for the door as protestations and curses followed us. A text from Bill indicated he was on the way as well. It was tempting to apply non-biological levels of speed, but that would have raised questions that would have required us to leave town, and might alert the administrator if they had a properly functioning intelligence-gathering network. Garfield waited at the entrance to an alley as we pulled up. Bill was still on his way. Traffic jam, he said. I'll be a while longer. How do you get a traffic jam in a horse and buggy world? I muttered. Maybe start a riot by peeking in the back of a wagon, Bridget muttered back. I make one mistake. We can't wait for Bill, Garfield said. They're significantly ahead of us. We rushed down the alley in single file. There was no sign of anyone, but there were also no alternative paths unless our subjects had suddenly developed the ability to climb walls. I had a momentary image of Spider Beaver in red and blue tights and gave myself a mental slap. Then I heard Garfield chanting, Spider Pig, and grinned. Bob is Bob, always and forever. As we rounded a corner in hot pursuit, several figures leaped out of nowhere and tackled us. Our computer reactions were fast enough for us to realize what was happening, but unfortunately, the Mannies operated in physical reality where inertia was a thing. We couldn't do more than start to turn in the direction of the attacks before we were all flattened. The old Mannies would have been too heavy to knock over, but the new models had appropriate mass for the subject species, so I found myself on my back looking up at a very angry Quinlan in the middle of bringing a knife down on me. It was time to abandon any pretense of being bio. I pushed up faster than the knife was coming down, and the Quinlan went airborne with an oof. I smacked him on the side of the head as he hit the top of his trajectory and sprang to my feet. If I'd calculated the force properly, he'd be stunned for a minute or two, but not injured. 2 more Quinlans flew backward, and my friends climbed to their feet. Bridget had been stabbed. Fake Manny blood was oozing out of a wound in her shoulder, and she looked pissed. I mean, really pissed. I considered for a moment whether I'd have to protect our attackers from her. Garfield pointed farther down the alley. Something going on. Without waiting for a response, he sprinted in that direction, waddled quickly. I examined our erstwhile ambushers. All 3 were in various stages of stunned, and there was no fight left. "You okay?" I said to Bridget. She nodded, still scowling. The internal nanites were doing their job, and the blood flow had already stopped. In another minute, there would be no sign of the wound, and even the fur would have grown back. We build well in the bobbiverse. The sounds of battle drifted back to us from the direction Garfield had disappeared. After a glance to make sure there was no further danger here, I went down on all 4s and galloped off after him, Bridget right behind me. When I got to the scene of the excitement, I found Garfield beating one Quinlan using another Quinlan as a bludgeon. It had a definite cartoon feel to it, and I stopped dead for a moment to watch. It was also physically impossible for a Quinlan, so there was a good chance that Gar had blown our cover. "Ixnay with the Superman act, okay?" I exclaimed. Garfield stopped, abashed, and dropped his bludgeon. The other Quinlan keeled over slowly, like an inflated Santa when the blower is turned off. "Do you think this was about Skeeve?" I asked via intercom. Garfield replied out loud. "I think that's who they were attacking." He motioned with his head. "He took off down that way. He's injured." I nodded and headed in the indicated direction. I found a Quinlan leaning against a wall trying to block blood flow from multiple wounds. He kept moving his hands from one wound to the next, muttering under his breath. I suspected shock. "Skeeve?" I asked, and he nodded. I quickly removed my backpack and extracted my first aid supplies. It was mostly bandages, but that was exactly what he needed. It took only moments to fix him up well enough that he'd at least live to get to a doctor. As I finished up, Garfield and Bridget joined us. I took one of Skeeve's arms and Bridget the other, and we hoisted him to his feet.
"Thanks," he said. "Are you with the Resistance?"
I opened my mouth to reply just as Skeeve's eyes went wide in surprise, and then I found myself face down on the ground. I could see, out of the corner of my eye, Bridget going down as well, with 2 Quinlans piling on. Yet another individual stepped up, pulled something that looked very much like a handgun, and shot Garfield, point blank. 22. Living in interesting times. Bob, July 2334, Galentown. Garfield glanced down at his chest, then snarled and grabbed the gun from his attacker. I didn't have time to be surprised. My passengers might have knives. I did an explosive push-up, and 2 Quinlans went flying. I heard noises that indicated Bridget might be doing the same, so I concentrated on my own problems. One of Bridget's attackers landed sort of on me as I was getting to my feet. I grabbed him by a handful of fur and applied a head slap. It seemed to be effective as a combat technique overall. I just hoped I wasn't giving them concussions or something. Bridget and Garfield had taken care of the other Quinlans, Garfield having used the gun as a club. That seemed overly dangerous, but I had enough sense to realize that lecturing him on it at this point probably wouldn't go over well. We turned as one to check on Skeeve to find him nowhere in sight. Some blood drops indicated which way he'd gone, and some of them had been stepped on, so he had company. But were they rescuing him or kidnapping him? Garfield peered back up the alley to the location of our first battle. "The first group is still there," he said, looking kind of out of it. "So this was a different group and only interested in Skeeve. This feels like a rescue." Bridget and I checked ourselves for stab wounds, then Bridget examined Garfield's chest closely.
No bullet wound. Was he shooting blanks?
"No, there was definitely an impact," Garfield replied. but nothing like a bullet. At least not like I'd imagine a bullet to feel like. I've got internal nanites checking it out right now. What the hell are you people up to? Bill asked over comms.
Lots and lots of shenanigans,
Bridget replied.
not all of our own making.
She motioned to the blood drops on the ground.
Let's follow them.